Hello, I'm Mary Smith and President of the American Bar Association. I welcome you to today's Law Day program. In 1958, the Cold War was the stark threat to U.S. national security. May Day military parades in Red Square and throughout the Soviet bloc, allegedly to celebrate International Workers' Days, were put on to show military might and stir up discontent within the United States. In 1958, ABA President Charles Ryan worked with President Eisenhower to establish May 1st as Law Day to our counter to celebrate the rule of law as America's foundation. In doing so, President Eisenhower issued the following statement: "The world no longer has a choice between force and law. If civilization is to survive, it must choose the rule of law." Voices of Democracy is the theme for Law Day 2024. Today, our nation and world are at an inflection point. At home and around the globe, autocrats and dictators threaten the rule of law. Our democracy is under strain. We must all use our voices to maintain our system of laws and to ensure that our democracy, as conceived, endures. I offer a tremendous thank you to our partners at the Law Library of Congress for their partnership in planning and leading this program. Today, we have a great discussion planned where you will hear about forces threatening democracy around the globe, including a decline in civic participation. You will hear how global voices of democracy are working to maintain healthy democracies around the world. Thank you for joining us this Law Day, and I hope you enjoy today's program.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, and thank you to Mary Smith for that inspiring and challenging opening remarks. My name is Elizabeth Anderson, and I'm the Executive Director of the World Justice Project and have a distinct honor of moderating today's discussion for Law Day, convened in the theme of Voices of Democracy. As Mary mentioned, we face significant challenges to democracy and the rule of law around the world, and I can think of no more appropriate theme than Voices of Democracy for this year's Law Day. The World Justice Project measures the rule of law globally through our Rule of Law Index published each year, and we have tracked a global rule of law recession since 2016, each year finding a majority of countries with deteriorating rule of law since that time. Declines have been particularly widespread and steep in our metrics of features of the rule of law that correspond to civic participation and engagement. Overall, fundamental rights is down in 77% of countries over the time since 2016, with an average decline of 9%. Freedom of expression is down in 78% of countries, with an average decline of 12%. Freedom of assembly and association down in 81% of countries, with an average decline of 12%. And civic participation is down the most of all in 83% of countries, with an average decline of 10%. The data for the United States, unfortunately, is mirroring very much what we see globally. The U.S. ranks 26th in the index, and since 2016, the U.S. rule of law score has dropped each year but one. Overall, its score is down 5% over this period, and it is down 16% for free expression, 11% for civic participation, and 9% for assembly and association. In short, the voices of democracy are under pressure. Against this backdrop, today's panel offers hope and inspiration, highlighting experience from across the globe of ways in which various actors are supporting and expanding voices of democracy and democratic participation and reversing the negative trends I've just summarized. Our panelists are a terrific group of experts with varied perspectives and experience. We'll begin with Professor Valerie Hans, the Charles F. Recklin Professor of Law at Cornell University School of Law. She'll be followed by David Sipp, who is team leader for a municipal anti-corruption program of the National Democratic Institute in North Macedonia and a longtime practitioner of rule of law development across the globe. Ellen Hofeberg will follow David. She is a foreign law specialist at the Law Library of Congress with a particular expertise in the law and practice in the Nordic countries and the European Union. And then I'll hear from Eduardo Suarez, foreign law specialist at the Law Library of Congress with expertise in Brazilian law and that of other Portuguese-speaking countries. Our program will end with some concluding reflections by the law librarian of Congress, Aslihan Bulut. Each of our panelists will make a brief 10-minute presentation about different examples of initiatives that are strengthening democratic participation. Drawn from across the globe, these experiences can provide lessons learned and inspiration for all of us to take similar action this law day to strengthen voices of democracy in the United States. The presentations by the four will be followed by discussion among the panelists and then questions from the audience. Feel free to pose your questions as you have them in the Q&A tab on your screens. And I will select some of those to pose to the panelists and stimulate the discussion. So with that, let's begin with Professor Hans. An expert in the empirical study of law and courts, Professor Hans will share learning about one of the longest-standing ways that citizens in the United States and across the globe engage in democracy, and that's trial by jury. Professor Hans.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate and feel honored to be able to participate in this important discussion about voices of democracy. And I'll be focusing on a subject that's very dear to my heart that I've been doing research on for many years, and that's trial by jury. I want to begin with a map. And Tiffany, if you can allow me to forward my slides, that would be great. This map is colored blue and white, and it represents about 10 years worth of research that I did with one of my collaborators, Sonia Kurtinjak-Ivkovic. She and I surveyed the world of countries to be able to and examined whether or not they had any form of lay participation, ordinary citizen participation in their legal systems, their criminal legal systems. So the countries in blue represent about 2/3 of the world's countries. They have different ways of incorporating lay people into their legal systems in criminal cases. 56 countries have juries. Another group have lay judges who participate along with professional judges on mixed courts. And still other countries have lay magistrates or justices of the peace, or in some other countries, tribal courts and courts that operate outside the formal legal system also rely on citizens, ordinary citizens, not law-trained judges. So one of the things you can see is that many, many countries around the world rely on lay people to make legal decisions, binding legal decisions in the cases. And when it comes to jury trials, as we've seen very recently, juries are often tasked with deciding some of the most important and significant civil cases. Elizabeth Anderson talked to us about these disturbing trends about declines in democracy and civic participation. And in my research, I've also seen similar kinds of trends when it comes to trial by jury. So in the U.S. and in some other countries, the percentage of cases that are decided by juries, and actually judges too, that's another story, but the percentage of cases that are decided by juries has declined, and in some cases quite precipitously. The figure you see on this graph starts in 1962 and ends in 2021, the last year that I was able to get complete data. Comes from a paper that I collaborated on with Richard Jolly and Bob Peck, and shows that in U.S. district courts over that 60-year period, we went from about 5.5% of cases, civil cases, being decided by juries to way less than 1%, 0.31%. So really a dramatic decline. And that's also found in some other countries. And what is more, in both the U.S. and in other countries around the world, there have been some constrictions in the types of cases juries can hear. Some countries have abandoned juries entirely. A smaller number have said, okay, we're not going to get rid of juries completely, but we're going to limit the kinds of cases that they can hear. And here in the U.S., there are restrictions, especially in civil trials, on damage awards, for example. Some states have limits on how much juries can award for pain and suffering. Now, these declines in the proportion of cases that juries hear definitely worsened during the pandemic. But I really want to say that only exacerbated an already rather startling trend. Next slide, please. So on the upside, on the more positive side, there was also in the kind of history and world history about juries, there are some fascinating pockets of what I'll call endurance. Some countries have introduced new jury systems or gone back to a jury system that was eliminated at an earlier, more politically fraught time. For example, Russia and Spain, both in periods of political liberalization, reintroduced their jury systems. Russia during the Glasnost period, and Spain after the dictator Franco died. And both countries kind of approached the ideals of democracy that are so embodied in trial by jury. South Korea also introduced a jury system called an advisory jury system after its period of military regime. And the country of Georgia, following the dissolution of the USSR, likewise introduced trial by jury. So you can see how in these periods of political democratization, people reach out and lawmakers and policymakers reach out for the trial by jury as a symbol of democracy and try to incorporate it into the legal system. Next slide, please. So I am doing some research that I find totally fascinating in Latin America, in the country of Argentina. In the last 10 years, 11 provinces in Argentina have passed jury laws or have already enacted trial by jury in a number of its provinces. And it's fascinating because way back in the 1850s, when Argentina enacted its constitution, it actually provided for jury trial in 3 articles. But it took 150 years or more to be able to begin introducing trial by jury, and it looks like it's actually caught the attention of lots of lawmakers. It started 10 years ago, and now you can see what the map looks like. Next slide, please. I'm doing some scientific research on the new jury systems of Argentina. My collaborators and I are using a lot of the techniques that we've used before with jury studies in the United States, including questionnaires and interviews and focus groups, to try to understand what it's like to be a juror under these unusual circumstances. I mean, in Argentina, our research has shown that some jurors, the first time they hear that their province has a jury system is when they receive a summons for jury duty. And in one of the provinces we've studied, the province of Chaco, actually, the jury commissioner's office goes personally to the homes of individuals who are being summoned so that they can explain what this new system is all about and why they should want to participate in it. But in our research, after these novice jurors decide a case, we give them questionnaires. We also survey judges and lawyers about, what it's like to try cases before a jury and what they think about the jury system. And I've been really intrigued about the overall positivity of both lawyers and judges about the new jury system. Most of them believe that the juries are competently deciding the cases, have good understanding of the facts and the evidence in the case, and jurors themselves report very little trouble in managing the case and deciding and deliberating, even though, again, they have no experience with it. They do have Hollywood movies to draw on. I guess there's that. One of the really important things that I think is significant for our discussion is when we asked about the impact of serving on a jury. One of the things that we found, and we found this in a number of provinces now, is that people say they have more confidence now in the legal system. They have more confidence in the jury itself, in the courts, in the government, and in the police, who often, of course, testify in criminal cases. They also say that as a result of them serving as jurors, they are now more likely to be engaged in public affairs, which is exactly the kind of counter to the decline in civic participation that we are looking for. Next slide, please. The findings that we are now discovering in Argentina with its brand new jury systems are actually quite similar and echo some of the findings we've discovered in U.S. jury research. John Gastel and his collaborators in the Jury and Democracy Project examined records of jury service and voting for thousands of jurors in the United States in a number of different locations. And one of their remarkable findings is that when it came to voters who were very unlikely to vote, what we call the low-frequency voters, where a lot of energy to try to get those people out to vote is concentrated on, when these low-frequency voters served as jurors, they tended on the very next elections to boost their likelihood of voting. So controlling for their low frequency before, but intervening the jury experience, we see afterwards an increase in their likelihood of voting. In other words, participating in one form of civic engagement encouraged these individuals who were less engaged to perform another act of civic engagement and voting. I also found with John Gastel and collaborators that this appeared, the boost in voting appears not only for criminal jurors, but also for civil jurors who decide other kinds of cases. Here we found that civil juries who participate in the classic kind of jury, 12-person juries that are unanimous, the kind that is required or is characteristic of most criminal juries, were also more likely to participate in the next election. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, I'll identify these benefits to a democratic voice in the jury. First, fact-finding benefits, ways in which jurors themselves bring the community's judgment to bear on conflicted facts in the criminal and civil contexts. They deliberate, they can correct one another's errors, and make sound decisions that reflect the community's views. Next, transparency, where we are able, because there is a jury in the room and it has to be spoken to disrupt the legalese, the typical legalese that judges and lawyers might use with each other. And that opens up the trial proceedings for everyone. And finally, the democratizing effects of jury service that I've just described. So we need to keep these in mind as we think about ways we can bolster our jury system in the United States and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerie. How interesting when we're thinking about expanding voices and supporting voices of democracy to think about dusting off an institution that we've had around for a long, long time, such as jury service. Really intriguing. We'll turn now to David Sipp, And another part of the world, David's going to take us to North Macedonia and describe some of the work that he's been doing there, expanding democratic participation in that country. David.
Thank you, Betsy. I'm happy to be here, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Betsy said, I'm currently working in the country of North Macedonia, which is in southeastern Europe. It's bordered by Greece to the south, Bulgaria to the east, Kosovo and Serbia to the north, and Albania to the west. It's a relatively small country with a population of just slightly over 2 million people. And I'm working with an organization called the National Democratic Institute, which is a non-governmental organization. It's a nonprofit. It's based in DC, and it's working in approximately 80 countries around the world. The work of NDI is primarily to support democratic institutions, and we do that through citizen participation efforts, mostly through working in electoral systems with parliaments, political parties, and with civil society. I'd like to present briefly 3 different examples of citizen participation here in North Macedonia that have taken place currently and within the last couple of years. Thank you. The first example I'd like to talk about is we're working with a group of women who are political leaders or working in parliament and who wanted to do something to combat violence that is taking place against them. Most of the violence is in the form of verbal abuse and verbal harassment, and women politicians are subjected to this quite often. What the women wanted to do is to develop a type of campaign environment, which looks like a campaign, I think, most anywhere. It included media spots, working with traditional media as well as with social media, radio and television ads, billboards. At the same time, within Parliament, they established a multi-party gender equity task force, which is a standing committee within Parliament now, and it's committed to advancing gender equality. And since the women were parliamentarians, they're representing all regions of the country. So the regions that they were from, those municipalities were also establishing commitments to support them and to ending the violence that was taking place against them. This had the effect of bringing the issue to national attention. People were speaking about it publicly, which hadn't ever happened before. Organizations as well as political parties made commitments to support the issue and end the violence, and the public is increasingly aware. Interesting. A side note, we are in an election cycle right now. We had presidential elections yesterday, which took place peacefully. There was some verbal abuse against 2 of the women candidates, but it was not as severe as what we have seen in the past. And in this first round of the election, there'll be a runoff in a couple of weeks. A woman was in the lead. The second example I'd like to talk about was where we were working with Roma. Roma are Europe's largest ethnic minority, and they often face systemic discrimination and are often underrepresented in all levels of government, national as well as local. Here in North Macedonia, there are several Roma who are members of parliament, and they established a caucus to begin talking about one of the most extreme issues that they face here, as well as elsewhere in Europe, and that was the issue of statelessness. Even though the Roma have been in North Macedonia for many, many generations, because they don't have the state-sanctioned identification documents, they're considered stateless. And that's an issue because while they're stateless, they can't access public services. They can't access the healthcare system or housing or other welfare benefits. They're essentially non-citizens. So the Roma caucus in Parliament was bringing this attention, was to a national level more and more, and they established for the first time oversight hearings that were taking place in Parliament to debate and talk about this issue and see what could be done about it. Sadly and tragically, during the time that they were establishing these oversight hearings, a young Roma boy who was ill subsequently died because of his illness, because he could not access the healthcare system here because he was considered stateless. This served to catalyze, or it was a catalyst for this whole activity. It became not just a national issue, but a regional and international issue. International bodies became involved. The UN became involved. And today, as a result, according to the UN, North Macedonia is the first country to eradicate statelessness. The third example I'd like to talk about is organizing with youth who are traditionally in North Macedonia also marginalized, and they're not being engaged in any real meaningful way in any type of political discussion or local decision making. And we were working with an organization based here in the capital city, and we were able to establish a coalition type organization with 18 essentially student unions around the country, either affiliated with universities in different parts of the country or organizations that were run and led by youth. And what they had decided to do is that they wanted to do their own research, surveys, and polling in order to find out what youth were concerned with and what interested them. And so they did this type of research, and they eventually presented it to Parliament. And probably not surprisingly, what was of most concern to the youth, and that continues today, is the lack of opportunities, the lack of jobs. And the value of the working with the youth at that level is that it contributed to building trusting relations between them and political leaders, whether they're political party leaders or members of Parliament. And that has led to more young people providing consultation and testimony in front of Parliament over issues that are important to them. And Betsy, I think I'll stop there, and I'll be ready to engage in the Q&A, but thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Those are three great examples of efforts to expand civic participation by groups that have been historically excluded, minorities, women, or groups that we see increasingly disaffected with democracy, youth. The polling data is quite troubling globally, that youth are not as trusting and committed to democracy. So these are important efforts in North Macedonia and other places. Thank you so much. Let me remind folks that if you have questions you'd like to pose to any of the panelists, please put those in the Q&A tab down there at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those after we hear from our next speakers. We'll turn now to Ellen Hofberg, who is going to speak about the EU Citizens Initiative, which is an innovative mechanism that allows citizens of EU member states to create legislative initiatives, which, subject to certain requirements, I'm sure she'll tell us about, then can be addressed by the European Commission and the European Parliament. Very intriguing. We're often frustrated that our Congress is stuck. Maybe there's an idea here about how we as citizens could get things moving. Over to you, Ellen.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And thank you for having this program. I always watch and so yes, I will speak about the EU Citizens Initiative and how citizens of Europe are having this opportunity to legislate. But first, I wanted to kind of show you the background for that and why they wanted to do it. And next slide, please. So the background was it was adopted as part of the Lisbon Treaty. As you will see from this slide that I wanted to show you, the European Parliament has, unfortunately, been suffering from low participation rate ever since the beginning. So this is the most recent participation rates divided up by country from 2019, the European Parliament election, from the Statista. You can see the source there. So as you can see, most of the countries actually fall below the 50% line for voter participation at the EU level, which is quite significantly lower than they are at the domestic national parliaments, right? You can see that countries like Finland has a participation rate of 40% in the EU Parliament, but they enjoy participation rates around 70, almost 80% in their national parliaments. So this has been an ongoing problem for the EU, really from the outset, that they wanted to be able to engage members, citizens of Europe on a bigger scale, knowing that, as you centralize power, people have a tendency to vote less. Next slide. So the question was then, what kind of initiative did they want to create? So in the EU, there's the European Commission that proposes legislation. But with this citizen initiative, citizens have the same opportunity as the European Parliament to ask the European Commission to present legislation. So in this particular case, you have to have members from 7 different EU member states. They don't have to be different nationalities, but they have to have residency in 7 different places. So you could technically have 7 Germans across Europe, and they go together and propose something. Now, you can't propose anything because it cannot be frivolous or it has to be within the prerogative of the European Commission, something that they can actually legislate. For instance, environment, consumer protection, agriculture, fisheries, energy, transport, or trade, just to name a few. And then once you've done that, you submit that to the European Commission that would publish it on a special designated citizen portal, and you start collecting signatures. So once you do that, those signatures then have to be verified by the domestic authorities in the different countries of Europe. Usually what happens is you can either apply the same rules for EU Parliament, which is either 18 or 60 years old voter, or you could have a special law that says for EU citizens initiatives, you can be 16 years as long as you are, if that is the only bar for you, if you would have otherwise been eligible to vote. So typically you are then 18 years or above, you're residing in one of the EU countries and you're a citizen in one of those countries. Then you start collecting these, and what they changed in 2020 when they realized that the citizen initiative was not getting the same tractions as they were hoping, was that they created one place where they collect all of the EU Citizens Initiative, and that is this website that the link that I provided right there. And if you click on that, you can see all the current initiatives that are up for signatures, and you can see who they are. You can see what they want to accomplish if they're successful, and that will stay up there for a year. And if it is successful, within a year, it will go to the European Commission. So what does it mean to be successful? Well, first of all, you have to have 1 million signatures. 1 million signatures out of 447 about million European citizens of the EU. And then depending on which countries your signatures come from, there's also a threshold depending on, it's measured by how many members of parliament you have in each jurisdiction. So for instance, Finland has fewer members of the European Parliament because it's a much smaller country than Germany, and versus Germany has more members of the European Parliament and therefore have a higher threshold. So for instance, Finland has 9,870 votes or signatures, and Germany has 680. So then you have to reach those thresholds for 7 different countries. Even reaching them for those 7 different countries won't meet the 1 million mark, but that's not the point. The point of it is that you want to make it so geographically dispersed. So you'd want it to be an issue that involves as many of the European countries as possible, and not just make it a local issue, right? Because the whole point is to make Europeans of the citizens of Europe, right? So, for instance, the first successful initiative was actually they managed to meet the 1 million goal before they met the 7 different country threshold goal, which shows you that it's not that easy to meet those thresholds, even though they seem low. For instance, for Finland, that threshold 9,870 is lower than they have for their own citizen initiatives for their parliament, which is 50,000. But it's broader; it's spread over the whole Europe. So what happens when you've met the requirement is that it goes to the European Commission, and the European Commission will then look at it, and they are required to send it they're required to send it both to the European Parliament and to the Council, as well as to national parliaments of the EU. And in addition, they have to send it to the European Economic and Social Committee, the Committee of the Regions. And no matter what the Commission thinks of it, at least the European Parliament has to have a public hearing on it. However, if the European Commission thinks, well, we don't want to go forward with this, they don't have to. It can end there, but you have a chance to have a public hearing and demonstrate, and make your case heard. And I think that was the intent, was that you wanted participants to have a more active way of influencing policy and not necessarily just creating policy. Next slide. So then there were a few successful ones. Like I said, the first one to reach, and these are in alphabetical order, so I apologize. So I won't, unfortunately, talk about them a little jiggered, but the first one to reach 1 million was the right to water. And the organizers were, even though it was never fully adopted, the legislation that they proposed, they claimed that it's partially addressed in their initiative in the proposed drinking water directive. So it was a positive outcome for them, even though they continue to advocate for additional measures. And then you have the ban glyphosate, which also was 1 million supporters, and their initiative is part of the revision of the General Food Law Regulation, as well as the pesticide reduction, which is a key priority in the Farm Fork strategy. So even though it's not all of their initiatives became law, they have been able to influence policy. Similarly, ending the aviation fuel tax exemption in Europe became part of the Green Deal, as well as the Fit for 55 legislative package. And they only reached about 75,000 signatures, but they managed to get a lot of international EU media, and they spurred a lot of support anyway, but it was not just by the 1 million target. And that it kind of also speaks to the problems that they've had with this initiative, is that it's not as known as they want it to be, but it is spreading them out younger. So to kind of David's point previously, is that it's becoming quite not popular, but it's becoming more known among the younger population. And that ending the aviation fuel tax exemption in Europe was actually done by 7 students. And that it also won a prize for the most efficient lobbying. And I want to say 2019. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was 2019. So those are some of the positive effects that you can see with the EU Citizen Initiative, is that thanks to this new collection platform, where you collect signatures online instead of going around with a paper ballot, it actually reaches young people quite a bit. And some of the other examples here, you can see that the end the cage age actually had about 1.4 million signatures, and it resulted in impact assessment, and the Commission still has communicated that they're still working on the initiatives in that one. Minority Safe Pack, also 1 million signatures, and for diversity in Europe. And then the last one, Single Communicate to RF Act, they were withdrawn, but the goal was met because there's no longer any Roman charges across Europe. So I think I'll end there. And yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellen. That's super interesting. And I imagine there'll be some follow-up questions in a minute, but we'll turn finally to Eduardo Suarez, who is going to share with us some insights from a new approach to environmental policymaking that is drawn from experience in Brazil. The Brazilian government has instituted a new process for engaging indigenous people in solving environmental and ecological problems. And Eduardo's going to tell us about that and see what we can learn from it.
Thank you, Betsy. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Today I'll talk about the recent creation of a ministry in Brazil that aims at engaging indigenous communities in the country's efforts to cope with the current environmental and ecological challenges by involving the original occupants of the land. When the newly elected administration took office in January of 2023, one of its first acts was to send a provisional measure to the National Congress establishing the basic organization of the government. This provisional measure created, among other things, the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, a new ministry that never existed in the federal administration, which is headed by an indigenous woman of the Guajajara people, known as Sônia Guajajara, who stood out for her historic fight for the rights of indigenous peoples and the environment. The newly created ministry managed to place the indigenous population on the national agenda and not only give voice to the Brazilian indigenous peoples, but the ability to do something for them. The provisional measure, which later was converted into law, defined the competence of the newly created ministry, which included indigenous public policy and the defense and management of indigenous lands and territories. During her inauguration speech, the minister was quoted as saying that the knowledge of traditional peoples and communities, which is recognized in the international treaties, is fundamental in coping with the climate crisis, and as such, it must be valued throughout the Brazilian territory through the implementation of policies that consider diversity. Earlier this year, the minister published a balance sheet covering its first year of existence. According to the document, in 2023, the climate agenda occupied considerable space in the minister's work and in the conception of indigenous public policies, in recognition of the leading role of the indigenous peoples in protecting the environment and biodiversity, an essential factor in stopping the growing climate change that threatens lives in the planet. Regarding the engagement of indigenous peoples to help resolve environmental and ecological problems, the balance sheet states that, and this is supported by evidence, that the indigenous people's way of life and consequently the way they deal with nature is an important contribution to alleviate the climate crisis. The climate agenda of Minister Guajajara involves participating in organizational meetings, working closely with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and establishing a technical cooperation agreement with the Ministry of Integration and Regional Development, designed to provide training to indigenous agents for the prevention, monitoring, and control of extreme events affecting the indigenous population. One of the ministry's noteworthy projects was the consolidation of a partnership established between the Federal University of Amazonas and the University of Porto in Portugal to implement solar energy projects in Brazilian indigenous territories. Since its creation, the ministry has participated in several international events, including the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, the COP28, held in Dubai last November, which featured the largest indigenous delegation in the history of the conference. And it was the first time that an indigenous woman headed the Brazilian delegation at the UN Climate Change Conference. Recently, a decree was enacted establishing the Steering Committee of the National Policy for Territorial Environmental Management in Indigenous Lands, resuming the territorial and environment management plans that are being developed together with indigenous communities to serve as a guide for managing their territories. In terms of conservation of the environment and the fight against deforestation, the ministry's work has been geared towards maintaining indigenous lands as a priority in the government's recovery plan for degraded and native areas in Brazil. According to a renowned international nonprofit organization, in the recent years, there has been an escalation of attacks on indigenous rights, and deforestation promoted by invaders has almost tripled compared to historical levels. The organization estimates that 24% of the Amazon territory is protected by indigenous peoples, who are therefore the main guardians of the forest, considering that more than 97% of the indigenous territories are covered by forest and native vegetation. The same nonprofit organization also states that the fight to mitigate the effects of climate change and global warming involves protecting these indigenous territories by granting the people living in these areas with access to adequate health, education, sanitation, transportation, communications, and sustainable economic development policies. In February 2024, the Institute of the Man and the Environment of the Amazon, a non-profit Amazonian scientific institution that carries out research and projects to promote social Environmental Development and Climate Justice in the region report that there was a significant reduction in forestation in protected areas, such as indigenous lands and conservation units. Such drop was the consequence of the reactivation by the current administration of the Action Plan for Prevention and Control of Deforestation in the Amazon. Indigenous lands in the Amazon saw a 42% reduction in forest clearing between August 2023 and March 2024, showing the lowest destruction in 6 years since 2018. The 2022 demographic census of indigenous peoples, released in August of 2023, showed that the country's indigenous population reached close to 1.7 million people. This represents 0.83% of the total Brazilian population, with more than half, in this case 51.2%, of the indigenous people concentrated in the legal Amazon, which is composed of 9 states and comprises close to 59% of the Brazilian territory. During the celebration of the Brazilian Indigenous Day that occurred on April 18th, Minister Guajajara highlighted the fact that Brazil has 305 indigenous peoples, and their territories are the areas where the lowest rate of deforestation occurs. Last month, the ministry launched a program called Sowers of Good Living to Heal the Earth, which main objective is to strengthen indigenous peoples and communities in their action aimed at protecting and managing their territories by supporting projects and initiatives that provide training, knowledge exchange, and social environmental education to the indigenous population. In the political arena, during an interview to a Brazilian newspaper this past March, Minister Guajajara admitted that the relationship with the National Congress is difficult, and it tends to worsen because the agenda that the ministry considers to be a priority is rejected by most of the members of Congress. According to her, this has to do with businesses' interest in the indigenous areas and the resistance to further implement the demarcation of these areas. She highlighted that so far, the government was able to establish the demarcation of 8 indigenous areas, and she hopes that in 2024, 6 more areas will be demarcated. To conclude, the creation of the ministry is the recognition of the important role played by the Brazilian indigenous peoples in the protection and preservation of the environment. Their deep knowledge of the land and traditional practice make them invaluable allies in the fight against environmental and ecological degradation. Collaborative efforts that respect their rights and incorporate their wisdom seem to be key to the success of sustainable conservation initiatives. Important steps are being taken to implement policies that engage the indigenous population in the preservation of the environment in Brazil. Now, one can only hope that these initiatives bear fruit in the long run. Thank you.
Eduardo, thank you so much. And my goodness, there's so much to think about here. I see particularly a lot of connections between the presentations by Eduardo, thinking about minority rights being championed by a dedicated ministry, and then looking at Ellen's presentation where we can see interests bubbling up from a broad citizen initiative, and then David identifying ways in which these interests can be championed through parliamentary cohorts. And maybe we need a little bit of all of those approaches to really strengthen voices of democracy. I want to encourage folks to continue to put questions in the Q&A while I pose a few questions to our panelists before we open it up to the broader group. If I might, so panelists, turn on your video so everybody can see you and we can be in dialogue here. And maybe I can start with David, if I may, and drawing on your work in North Macedonia, or in other countries, or frankly, NDI's work in 80 countries. I'm interested in your perspective on what it is that is driving these negative trends that we're seeing, that we're working against. What is causing the deterioration in civic participation and engagement globally? And so what are we working against? And what is it in your initiatives that's been successful in countering that?
Yeah, thank you, Betsy. We are here in North Macedonia, and I think in a lot of countries where NDI is working, we do these annual polls and tracking polls and surveys. And what we've learned here is consistent to what you and the World Justice Project has learned, especially as it relates to youth engagement and youth involvement. And what we're finding here is that there's been a concerning decline in levels of youth participation. Primarily, what we're learning, that's due to there's just this growing disconnect between youth and the traditional established institutions of participation. So like political parties or parliament, there's just this growing dissatisfaction that's leading to this disconnect. And what youth are saying to us is that these institutions are basically just failing them because they're not able to adapt to the ways that young people are participating or want to participate. Even though, the institutions like parliament and parties continue to play critical roles in the function of the government, they're not adapting, or at least adapting quick enough to at least in the minds of the young people here in North Macedonia. And sadly, they're becoming irrelevant or less relevant.
Well, that's sobering indeed. I was going to suggest that they all just needed to serve on a jury. But maybe we need to look even more than that. Ellen, maybe I can turn to you and the experience, a quite innovative experience of these citizens initiatives. What are the lessons that you've learned there, particularly maybe about engaging youth, but more broadly, getting people to buy in, and what can we take away from it?
I think one thing when you look at it is when you tie it to a 1 year period where it's online and it's on this, the individual schedule. So you can go and you can participate whenever you want. If you compare it to a ballot initiative, which requires that the person goes and vote at that specific time, right? And since you can see that there is a lack of young people voting, them showing up at the ballot box is not as likely as if you give them this whole year and you can meet them. And I think what the European Union saw was that once they started making it easier, when they made the signatures easier to do, you do them online and you can do them through EIDs. Like Sweden has them, for instance, you use your bank ID, it's done, and it makes it easy also for the authority that has to check those signatures in the end that, they signed in using their bank ID. It's valid, it's quick, You meet young people closer to where they are. That not said, it's the same problem, right? But at least you're not losing them already at the ballot box. That's, I think, what we saw from the EU experience.
Great. Mallory, I saw you take off your mute. Maybe you wanted to jump in on that exchange with David.
You asked, what are really the causes of decline? And in addition to some of the things that, David put so well about dissatisfaction and declines in community groups that previously may have pulled people together as opposed to apart, there is a special thing when it comes to juries, and that is a lot of the scope of trial by jury is taken over by professionals. So judges, lawmakers, lawyers, all in the interests of efficiency, think that they can do things a lot quicker, a lot more quickly, and resolve things a lot more readily. And who knows if juries are competent anyway, and they have the expertise. So efficiency and expertise. So those have proven to be pretty powerful arguments. And I think in addition to the other things we've been talking about, they help to explain why we've had some constriction on trial by jury.
And what do you think might be a strategy for reversing that?
Well, one of the barriers is that a lot of people are reluctant to serve on juries. And so I think, I'd love to see a cultural shift where people, instead of initially thinking about how all the individual barriers and problems that they're going to have if they have to devote some of their lives to trial by jury, if they instead think of it as, an incredible honor to participate actively in self-governance. And then I think, what we see with actual juries is when people have accepted the invitation to participate actively, they come away really quite positive about the system and think it was a good use of their time. So they kind of overestimate how difficult it is and how much burden it's going to be. And I think underestimate what they will get out of it by collaborating with other people from their community on an important political, social issue.
It sounds like juries might be a topic ripe for some civic education initiatives to really highlight that it's not such a onerous service, that there are lots of benefits, both personally and for society. Eduardo, if I can turn to you and bring you into the conversation, tell us what you think was the key to the success of the new ministry in Brazil and what we might learn from that.
Well, thank you for the question. I believe the first success we can take from that is its creation itself. It has never happened before. And it's been only 15 months that it's been in existence. So it's a work in progress. A lot of it is being programmed. A lot of it is being developed. Hopefully, the ministry will have the political tools also to implement such programs, to implement such change, because it cannot be only based on good intentions. You have to have an active participation, an active will to make things happen. And it's a start. The indigenous peoples had never had a voice and the ability to do something. And now the new ministry is being headed by an indigenous woman who has first-hand knowledge of the situation in the area. And also now she also has to deal with the political facade of the problem, which also it's a different kind of way of dealing that. And to create a situation where the indigenous people can really do what they have been doing for so long, it would be great. That would be a great way to give voice, as you are talking about, voice of democracy, to give voice to a people that has never been heard before. Not in the sense that they never heard that complaints, but in the sense, okay, why don't we do it this way? Because that's the way we do it here. Why not? Let's try it.
Yeah. It sounds too like the minister herself is maybe a critical part of the secret sauce in this example. Often in the work that we do, advancing the rule of law around the world, we find it often leadership, an individual plays a critical role in these efforts. Is that a fair assessment of what's going on there?
Well, she's been very active in the fight for indigenous rights and also for the environment. So I would say that you highlighted perfectly as the secret sauce is the ministry and the minister. The combination of the two.
Right. Maybe this is a good moment for me to put in the Q&A and alert folks to an award that the American Bar Association has announced will be given at its annual meeting in August It's called Unsung Heroes of Democracy. And it's looking to highlight, maybe it's the jurors or the poll workers or the not necessarily the ministers, but the more quiet, unsung heroes who make democracy work. So I'll post in the Q&A some information about that. The deadline for nominations is May 15th, and I really want to encourage the folks who are on this program to think about those who really should be celebrated with this award. Let me ask one more question. I'm going to open it up to the larger group, and I'll ask it of all of you and chime in as you see fit. And that is, how applicable is all of this to some of the rule of law and democracy challenges that we have in the United States? And how do we make it apply in the United States if it does? And I'll go maybe in the order I did previously. David, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Betsy. I think that if I were going to point to a secret sauce that was running through the three examples that I talked about, I would say that all of them involved an issue that affected people deeply and broadly. And I think that is something that's applicable to the states as well. I mean, that's what is needed to get a group of, light a fire underneath a group of people that spreads exponentially to address those issues. So I think it's trying to frame the issue in a way that is impactful and is of deep interest to as broad and as wide of a group of people as possible.
Great. Ellen?
So for the EU Citizens Initiative, obviously that is almost like constitutional issue. It's created by the Lisbon Treaty. So to create that kind of power for the individual would probably require constitutional law change in the US, which might not be the easiest. I'm pretty sure the Netherlands has theirs in their Parliamentary Procedure Act. So that might be a way to circumvent it. But what it makes the initiative special is that it's across all the states. You have to have from a quarter of the European, right? So it's 7 member states because it's a quarter of the 27. I think maybe something like that, maybe something that could be an initiative that was across the U.S. that, often we hear that we are a little bit divided as a country, geographically, politically. And I think this effort in Europe was something that was trying to bridge and have people come closer together from geographically different places to find, a policy that they wanted to influence. And I still think that you could do that on a lobby level. You could, have a meeting for members from different states.
Sure. If nothing else, even if we can't enact that kind of constitutional change and create that kind of process, there are lessons to be learned about coalition building across the country and really building broad coalitions for legislative initiatives. Great. Valerie, let me turn to you. Obviously, we have jury trials in the United States. How can we do more?
Yeah, well, I'm really struck by all these initiatives and the way in which a number of them really try to attend to groups that have been left out, have been underrepresented. And we do have that as a challenge of our own U.S. jury system. It turns out we have good practices, we have best practices to try to get fully representative juries from the community. And we can definitely do more on that score so that the jury that hears a case actually that reflects our ideal of a community that represents.
having a hard time unmuting myself. Thank you. That's interesting. And I didn't realize that about, the particular groups being less active in the jury system. So,
yeah, if I could just add one fascinating thing about the Argentina juries, they took a lesson from the United States and the difficulties that we often have in paneling fully representative groups, and they require gender parity. All of the jury systems have a requirement that no more than one half of every jury, every 12-person jury, be male or female. So it's fascinating. And with respect to Eduardo's really interesting description of the effort to bring Indigenous people in 2 provinces, there are provisions for Indigenous juries. One was just impaneled in the province of Chaco to hear a case involving Indigenous peoples. So it's so some of the new jury systems are, really innovative in a way that incorporates the broad community that I find quite admirable.
Great. And Eduardo, let me turn to you then, and lessons from the Brazilian experience for the United States.
Well, the secret sauce, as you mentioned, would be the key. The U.S. is not dealing with the deforestation on the same level that Brazil is, but it's dealing with climate change. So, as Valerie mentioned, now they created a jury for indigenous people. So they are bringing people into the jury that had never participated before. So maybe to start spreading the voice of democracy as it is the theme of our presentation here, of a celebration of Law Day here, would be to bring people that are really involved with the issues, with the themes that are concerned, and not only reserved for the professional, let's put it this way, the professional politicians. Let's take a more hands-on approach. That would be my take from the Brazilian experience. Okay, let's bring the indigenous people. So why don't we do it in all other areas? Let's bring all people together and be heard.
Hear, hear. There's while I've got you and you're unmuted, there's a question in the Q&A, and I'm going to turn to these now and invite others to pose. We've been answering some of them as we've been going, but there's a question to you, Eduardo, about what are the prospects really of democratic institutions and activities protecting the Amazon forests for Indigenous people and communities for the long term?
Well, hopefully the ministry will spread its wings and bring all the help it can get. Help is help. No labels. If they are willing to really preserve, to fight deforestation, to combat climate change, I believe they would be more than welcome. And it's more than 50% of the Brazilian territory. It's the legal Amazon, which is composed of 9 states. So there's a lot of space for help. That would be my short answer.
Good. Well, that is helpful. There's a question from Amanda Narakis, who's typing in from Columbia, Maryland, and she's a pre-law student studying entertainment business, and has a really helpful reminder to all of us, which is the power of music, and maybe especially for young people. I'm wondering about the role that artists can play in promoting democracy. Certainly we at WJP are often quick to say that the rule of law is not just for judges and lawyers, that it really takes all of society and a multidisciplinary effort, tapping into lots of different walks of life, professions, and voices, including those from the arts. Anyone have examples of where they've seen that work effectively? Singing juries, Valerie? I know there are examples.
Nothing on juries, but I'm just thinking that would really be phenomenal. I hope artists out there are thinking about ways to create some captivating music, maybe to go along with the summons to get a recording.
Well, if I may, as I just mentioned, we should spread the ability to people to have a voice, and Amanda's example is a good one. So it's music, it's art, it's everywhere. It's not only has to be pinpointed to indigenous problems, environmental problems. There are a lot of other issues that are out there that people need to be heard. And music is one of them. It's just one. There are many others.
At the World Justice Forum, which WJP convenes every other year to bring together the global rule of law movement, we always have a thread of our program that focuses on the arts. Last year's, or it was 2022, was our last forum, featured an incredible group of musicians from Afghanistan who were now in exile. They had all moved to Lisbon and were starting a new music school there because after the Taliban took over, again, they were unable to play their instruments and have their music school in Kabul. And there were dancers, and there was several film screenings about films that highlighted rule of law topics. So I think it's a point very well taken. There was a question in the Q&A about EU applicant states and the tracking of democracy in EU applicant states. And Ellen, maybe I could turn to you to respond to that. How are democratic rule of law performance assessed in applicant states?
Well, so obviously the EU does that on themselves, right? That's part of the application package to the EU. But I was almost going to ask David. He has more firsthand knowledge of North Macedonia being a country that wants to get into the EU, being a candidate state. That he might have a better insights. I have not for this particular project looked at it, but one of the continuous problems for states that want to become a part of the EU is usually that the voting, voter participation is generally very low compared to other EU states, and overall democracy is not where we hoped it would be.
David, how do you see the EU accession process playing out in North Macedonia?
Well, it's been a long road here. I think it started, Betsy, I think it started when you and I were still working together at ABA Sealy back in 2004, maybe? I think that's about the time that North Macedonia, then it was called Macedonia, started its ascension process, and it still goes on to this day. And there continues to be a lot of barriers to it, political barriers within the country, as well as some barriers to some of our neighboring states. And it continues to be a real challenge for the country. Every year, I'm not intimate with the process, but every year there's I think every year there's reports that need to be filed and meetings that have to be held to get one step closer. But it's been a really, really long road for North Macedonia, and I think it's going to be for quite some time.
Yeah, I just posted in the Q&A a link to the WJP Rule of Law Index, which gathers data on, I think, all of the EU applicant states at this point. And the questioner might find that interesting. That data is used along with a lot of other data sources on the EU reports that Ellen was describing. And Ellen, maybe I can turn back to you. And I was intrigued and somewhat troubled by the declining voter participation in European elections. And we've got European Parliament elections coming up soon. And I'm wondering what is expected in that next round? Might we reverse those trends? Might the citizen initiative have mobilized voters?
Oh, I'm not sure the citizen initiatives have mobilized them in that regard, but I don't have the latest projection of what the actual numbers are going to be, but there has definitely been a big push. There continues to be a big push, and just to make people aware that the elections are taking place. I think a hindrance on the national stage is that they don't coincide with the national elections, which people are more familiar with, and they happen in a time when people are not used to going to an election that right then, and they're also they are somewhat removed, right? Brussels is very far from most of Europe, and especially now, people are looking at other things. Fingers crossed that it's going to get better. I don't have the numbers. I wish I did, but there is a push that they have their own page. There's outreach, especially towards younger citizen, and I want to say Austria has 16. I should look in my papers, but there are several jurisdictions that now have lowered the election age for eligibility to 16. That might spark some uptick in participation if you previously were not, and 16 years now you are allowed. That could influence it. Let's hope, but at this point, we'll just have to cross our fingers and hope for the best.
Okay.
If I could jump in.
Yes, please, Valerie.
If I could. Okay. I mean, I just loved what you were talking about in terms of citizens' initiatives. And, the work that I've seen on deliberative democracy initiatives does show that if people participate in one way, they often then are encouraged to participate in some other form of civic engagement. So I think it's quite possible that people who have, for whatever reason, gotten involved in one of the initiatives might well then, that might well lead them to be more likely to vote coming up. So I guess I would kind of encourage you or ask you, what could be done to make these even more readily available to people and get broader participation. I think it probably could increase the likelihood of voting.
I think you're right. Ellen, can we, since several of us were talking about minority rights and minority voices, I was intrigued to learn more about the Right for Minority Citizen Initiative. What was that aiming for? And is that something that we might think about?
Which one?
The right, there was one, I think, that was called Right for Minority.
The Minority Safe Pack one?
Yes.
For diversity in Europe? I am not intimately, and I should have this up, but I don't. So the Minority Safe Pack was part of, they wanted to, they actually got 1.3 million and reached this, and they wanted to, so that's about the linguistic minorities, and they wanted proposed, more access for them. And actually, that is something that's easier done across the board, right? If you have a very small linguistic minority in one country and you have one in another country, you have them across the board and they actually become a pretty big group, right? 1.3 million. So I think that was an excellent, I should have talked about more of that during my presentation. I'm sorry, they all get mixed up together, but that is something that's quite phenomenal that we can get more minority language rights in that sense, because usually that is hard because it's such a small minority.
And language rights, I think it's quite natural, can be a really important catalyst for participation. Wow, lots to digest here. I hope folks on the call are inspired. Law Day is next Wednesday, May 1. And I certainly am inspired that there are things we can do to turn the tide on the rule of law recession and spark more citizen participation. And it's really something for all of us to roll up our sleeves and work on. I want to thank the EBA again and the Law Library for convening us, and turn over for final words of reflection to the Law Librarian of Congress, Aslihan Bulut.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Indeed, I certainly felt inspired myself. I really enjoyed the global perspectives and the conversation, and the questions. So it was quite engaging. Yes, I'm Aslihan Bulut, and I have the privilege of serving as the Law Librarian of Congress. I want to also thank President Smith and our panel for this engaging and thought-provoking discussion. And I want to thank all of you for joining us to celebrate Law Day. We invite you to visit the Law Library's Legal Research Institute online at law.gov to learn more about our upcoming events and webinars. And please visit the American Bar Association at americanbar.org to learn more about Law Day and events that commemorate Law Day. Thank you so much for joining us.